Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's 1 million by 1 million online rendezvous. This is Sramana Mitra, founder and CEO of 1M by 1M, coming to you live from Silicon Valley, California. 1M by 1M, as you know, is the first and only global virtual accelerator for technology startups in the world. Our mission is to help 1 million entrepreneurs reach $1 million and beyond in annual revenue. And in support of that mission, we do a lot of work through different touch points to come to you, to touch your work, to make it available for you to access all the resources that we've brought together. Now, in these sessions, we do mostly Q&A and discussions. So today we're going to do a discussion on the trends in EdTech. One question we get all the time is, how do you work with me? How can you get feedback from me on your venture? Well, come to one of the free public roundtables, and those are safe working sessions where you can bring your slides and your pitch, and I will work with you to brainstorm and strategize with your project. Essentially, what you have there is a WebEx call and a roundtable. So go to the website 1mby1m.com, go to free public roundtables, and you will find there what I'm talking about, which is the schedule as well as the registration links and everything for those sessions. So I hope to see you there. There is one this week and one every week right now. We are past the holidays, so this is peak working time, and we will be available pretty much every week. So let's switch over to the discussion with Betsy Corcoran, whom I've known as my editor in Forbes for a long time. I used to write a column for Forbes at the time when Betsy was the editor of Forbes, technology editor of Forbes, and then she went on to found EdSurge, which is kind of like the TechCrunch of education, EdTech. EdTech is very contemporary, of very high importance and of very high current contemporary relevance right now because of COVID. Technology has played a central role in educating people, both children and adults. So we have been covering EdTech quite a bit. If you look at my 8 startup ideas for the post-COVID world post on our blog, you will see that I have covered EdTech there as well with an idea. In fact, recently in one of the sessions, I shared with you a discussion with Betsy about this idea. So let's actually dig into the trends, and then we will, after we finish that, we can, if there is time, we will do a bit of Q&A. So Maureen, let's switch to the discussion with Betsy. Thank you.
We are going to start today's show with a conversation with Betsy Corcoran, co-founder of EdSurge. As I said, Betsy was my editor at Forbes, and we spent, I think it was about 3 wonderful years interacting every week. I would make sure my article is on her desk every week. and the most fun we had, I think, was when the financial crisis hit at the end of 2008. I wrote a piece called Capitalism's Fundamental Flaw. And that piece was on the homepage of Forbes for a month, Forbes.com for a month. So, and one of the earlier pieces that I did with Betsy, right when I started writing for Forbes, was something about, I don't remember what exactly was the title, but it was something to do with the Indian outsourcing industry dying, a death of Indian outsourcing. Now I remember, death of Indian outsourcing. I have never received so much hate mail in my life. I live a very, benign life. I kind of encourage entrepreneurs. What's so controversial about encouraging entrepreneurs, right? My goodness, that article was like it had hit some nerve somewhere, and oh my God, woof. So that's how far we go back, and it's a real pleasure, Betsy, to have you on. I know you've done great things with EdSurge. I've watched from a distance. So let's actually introduce EdSurge a bit.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. I think I've been part of one or two other roundtables, and it's always a delight. It's been such an enormous pleasure to see how you've grown 1 million by 1 million, and the work that you started at Forbes is clearly living on and inspiring people all over the world, and that is incredibly exciting to see. I think you've always been also yourself a fantastic entrepreneur, because you're right, your articles always showed up on time, and well done. And the demands of being an entrepreneur are high. You have to show up every single day. You have to be prepared. And so you are a wonderful exemplar in everything that you've done. You're right, Sramana, that I left Forbes in 2009. I spent a year learning about the education world, working as a volunteer IT person in the schools, getting under desks and counting computers and talking with educators. And what I learned at the time was that there was a huge disconnect in the way that technology was built and the needs of the schools. And you like numbers, so, here was the number that I was riveted by, which was that there was one IT person per 1,000 students on average in America. And that means that if you have desktop software that has to be updated one desktop at a time, you have an impossible problem. It is simply not going to work. And so what happened around 2010 was we had moved so much software into the cloud from a corporate point of view. Schools starting to move software into the cloud made an extraordinary difference. So I love to think about that as a great example of how when there's a fundamental shift, it opens up a new set of opportunities. Moving software into the cloud meant that one IT person per 1,000 students could actually now update, manage, and support software applications, and that made it workable in schools. So there were lots of other things that went on, but that was a fundamental part of the change. And so EdSurge, we started EdSurge to essentially be a sort of tech crunch of education. And the fundamental mission was to give voice to educators to help them explain and say over and over, here's what we need, because every great entrepreneur knows that you must listen to your customers, right? You say that all the time. I see it in your writing all the time, and it's probably the greatest truth and also the thing that's violated most egregiously sometimes by companies, which is you have to listen to the voice of your consumer. And so a big part of the mission of EdSurge was to amplify the voice of educators who are amazing people who are willing to put up with a lot of crap and so sometimes don't always say what is it that they need. And so EdSurge, we grew for, 8 or 9 years. At the end of last year, we were acquired by ISTE, which is the largest association of educators using technology on the planet. And I stayed with the organization for the first 6 months to kind of help with the transition. And then it was time for a break. And so I left ISTE, which I admire enormously. I'm really proud of the fact that EdSurge is a part of that organization. And the team has continued to do great work, continued to write, continued to support educators, and continued to try to expand on this mission of amplifying the voice of the users, the educators, and to try to explain how technology works and when it does and when it doesn't. So that's a little bit about EdSurge. And, yeah. So.
So, Betsy, we have gone through a huge shift. The cloud computing shift is huge, clearly. We started, on our blog, we started the Thought Leaders in Cloud Computing series. I'm trying to remember whether it was 2007 or 8, but it's been a long time. So, it's amazing nowadays, all these companies that are going public with multi-billion-dollar valuation, many of them have come through either our Entrepreneur Journey series or our, Incubation Radar series in 2010. We've seen these companies as fledgling companies, and I know many of these CEOs personally because of that. And it's really become a very robust trend. But alongside, there is this other major trend that happened also starting in 2007. I'm again remembering our time together at Forbes when the smartphone was introduced, right? That was like
Absolutely.
a watershed. And one of the applications, there are like a couple of applications that I use for learning during COVID. One of them I've been using for the last 4 years, but during COVID I've done it every day, which is Duolingo. I think it's an incredibly well-designed app, and I imagine there is a lot of that kind of great apps in the K-12 space as well. So could you talk a bit about the key trends besides cloud computing, besides the smartphone? If you double-click down into more of the EdTech space, what are you seeing? How do you synthesize these trends?
Sure. Well, of course, it doesn't take a soothsayer or a genius to see what the most important trend is right now, which is obviously been COVID. That has swamped every other factor, every other thing in our world. And so when I was thinking about this, I wanted to kind of identify a couple of different trends, and you have to start with COVID because there's absolutely no question. It has obviously created this incredible step up to hybrid learning. It has huge implications for social emotional learning, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things you brought up in your essay later on. And it also has brought in a tremendous number of expenses to educators, to school systems that they had not anticipated. Nobody expected that they were going to be doing as much cleaning as we've all been doing this past year. So we do have to kind of observe that COVID has swamped virtually all the other trends that are going on. A secondary trend to that has been the economic downturn, which again has kind of been catalyzed by COVID. With that comes the work at home trend, the whole question of the role of parents in learning, and the fact that professional development is totally a train wreck right now, whether that's professional development for the educators or actually professional development for the parents, who are, in many instances, now a primary teacher for their students. So there's a whole collection of trends around the economic downturn. Third set of trends, again, not rocket science. The bitterness of the political world has been a big deal, and the role of the federal government going forward in education is really going to be interesting. And what we saw was during the Obama administration, there was a very big role for the federal government. The Trump administration swung that way over to the other side, basically kind of wiping its hands of pretty much anything except for some regulatory issues. The Biden administration, we have yet to see. We don't have a Secretary of Education appointment yet that's been made public. And so we will see what the implications of that are. There's also kind of a whole collection of sort of political trends that are really interesting. A footnote to that is we've had a lot of conversation about the role and the need for civic education. I think what we've seen is an incredible civic engagement by young people that transcends whether anybody wants to sit around and learn about how a bill becomes a law. So I think civic education is kind of a really interesting area, and it's changing radically. There are some obviously other really huge trends that are going on. The role of artificial intelligence is a very interesting and very complex trend. What we know is that we've always known that every product is based on a set of assumptions, right? When you build something, even if you're building a mousetrap, you're building it based on a set of assumptions about how the world works and about how things work. In a mousetrap, those assumptions are pretty obvious. Mouse likes cheese, perhaps, or likes food, and then the thing comes down and goes whack. Unfortunately, in software, the assumptions are not always obvious, and when you add in artificial intelligence, which is basically a way, as you, I'm sure, have talked about in great detail, a way of using algorithms to sort of drive forward, sort of change, iteratively make change, the assumptions become murkier and murkier and murkier. So there's a whole interesting set of questions around what the role of artificial intelligence is, how much transparency we could or even can have around the assumptions and the implications that are built into that software, and what those implications are for learning. So there's a whole set of trends around that. So, you know, those are really big things. We have had a cataclysmic change in our world. I, for one, expect that the implications of COVID are going to be with us for generations. There is no school on the planet that wants to be caught flat-footed again. We should and will expect to see viruses and pandemics as a part of the landscape of our world going forward. And that means that schools are going to have to plan what's going to happen if we have to do a shutdown again in the future. All of those things suggest to me that hybrid learning is absolutely essential and will continue in some degree going forward. And we don't have the tools to do that very well right now. So we have no lack of trends right now. And
so this is actually a perfect segue into my next question. What is not working in COVID? Obviously, there's been a much bigger, much faster shift into online learning and learning from home, you know, like massive scale learning from home that the world was not quite prepared for, perhaps. Even the bandwidth was not there in a lot of cases, and, you know, especially amidst poverty, there's not enough of an atmosphere, both technical infrastructure as well as just pure peace and quiet, to do that kind of learning at home. What else is not working from your vantage point?
Sure. So, number one, the social components are really complex and are not necessarily working right now. We had developed over, you know, generations, whatever, millennia, a set of expectations about what happens when we're physically together and how we interact. And all of those rules, all of those instincts are rendered mute or rendered different when we go online. I've talked to students who, you know, have had both experiences. Some feel more empowered by being online. They can engage more. Some feel absolutely overwhelmed. English language learners have pointed out to me that they don't always know which language they should be typing in. And that's complex. Should they be, you know, I talked to one girl who said, hey, I've got 3 keyboards in my life. I've got an English keyboard, I've got a Farsi keyboard, I've got, I think, a French keyboard. Which language am I supposed to be communicating in when I talk to my friends, when I talk to my teacher, when I'm talking in this environment? Because in her real life, she would probably speak with her friends in Farsi, and she'd speak to her teacher in English, and then At other times, she would use French. And, you know, what she wasn't even sure which language she should be using at what point in time and which keyboard she should be using. And so that meant that her ability to react was actually significantly slowed down. We haven't figured out any of those kinds of interactions. For a huge, huge portion of students, the classroom has been a safe place. It's been a place where they are physically safe. It's been a place where they are fed. It's been a place where in some instances they can get personal hygiene, clothing, you know, a lot of protective elements of their life. It's been a place where they've felt valued. Now, that may not be the case, as you've rightly pointed out. Not everybody has a beautiful home where they can sit quietly at a desk and, you know, focus on a keyboard and a screen. Lots of families are sharing computers, are sharing tables. They've got multiple things going on at the same time. So we have not figured out any of those kinds of things in online working. Second area has to do with, are we learning? What are we learning? So for better or for worse, we have a collection of measures of achievement in, again, the plain old-fashioned world. We make people take tests and we assign some value to those outcomes. Well, what does testing look like in an online environment? What's the measure between, you know, testing for knowledge and testing for competency? How are we demonstrating that? None of those things do we really have a very good handle on. And then a third area would be the interaction of the parents. I've talked to a lot of teachers who say, I realize that I'm not just teaching the kids, I'm teaching mom or dad or an uncle or a grandma or something like that. People know, teachers know that just outside the boundaries of that screen, there may be other people lurking. And sometimes they're sharing answers. Sometimes they're speaking in other languages. There's all kinds of things that are going on in the periphery. We have no idea of who is participating in this education experience and how do we include them? Why would we leave them out? When we work in a company, we learn to work in community. We have to work in community. This has changed our idea of learning in community in a pretty profound way, and we haven't built up any set of ideas around what that means. So all of that is not to critique the amazing work that educators, families, kids have been doing. They've been incredible. And the fact that we've learned, you know, even half of what people have learned over the last 6 months is a testament to the spirit, the energy, the determination of educators, parents, students, all across the board. So please don't take anything that I'm saying as a critique, but do we have a lot to learn? Oh, yeah.
Well, it's an anthropological moment in, you know, in the history of the human civilization. So it's going to be a year of slow learning. Well, you know what? It is an anthropological moment. Get used to it.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, switching gears, you know, we do this Thought Leaders in Online Education, Thought Leaders in EdTech series as well. And that also we've been doing for a long time. We've tried to cover as much of the trends as possible. So from what you've done it at a much bigger scale because your focus is just education. What are the most interesting EdTech startups on your radar at this point, and why do you consider them to be the most significant and important?
So I'll give you a couple of different areas that I'm really intrigued with, and I can't tell you that these are going to be the companies that will win or you know, sort of become, I hate the word unicorns, but, you know, whatever. But I think that they're interesting and important. So number one is infrastructure, right? We're currently having this conversation on a WebEx platform. From WebEx gave birth to Zoom, of course. We all know that story of how Eric sort of took what he learned at Cisco and moved on. I would argue that there's an opportunity to build a new set of platforms that, once again, speak better to the needs of the people who are using them. Zoom wasn't built for learning, wasn't built for education, was built for meetings. And a certain way that we have historically done meetings, it assumed that most of our meetings, that many meetings were still in person, and that we could simply extrapolate from the in-person meetings to online meetings. I think that we're at a stage that's, and Sramana, you'll appreciate it, hopefully, because I'm dating myself and you won't mind too much. But if you think about where we were in, say, around 1993 with web browsers, there were at least a dozen companies, of which, originally Mozilla became Netscape, became one of the most crucial and important ones, but there were like a dozen different companies that were all coming up with versions of a web browser. I think that we are potentially at a comparable stage. Zoom or WebEx, Made, or Microsoft Teams are all big players, but we're starting to see a group of newcomers, including groups like Engagely, which is started by some of the folks who are involved with Coursera. And there's also Zoom EDU, which has nothing to do with Zoom, or I think it's called Education EDU. I get a little confused by it, but Michael Chasen, one of the founders of Blackboard. We're going to see the evolution of new ways of doing this online collaboration, and I think we're only at the beginning of that. So I expect to see a lot going on in the infrastructure stage. Secondly, upskilling. There is no question about the need for everyone to continue learning. And Duolingo has been a wonderful example of language learning, a specific thing, but we're seeing a tremendous amount of work around how do we help learners make that transition to the other things I need to learn in my life. Guild, OnRamp, Little Company, Career Karma, all of these folks are aimed at trying to help people figure out how do you go from where you are to where you want to go next. And I think the upskilling and the or sort of adult learning category has got a tremendous amount of growth and a tremendous amount of opportunity for it. A third area is I love some of the things that we're seeing that bring joy and fun to us. We've started to see a few, some of them are really silly, right? And they're outside education, but they could become an indicator for things going forward. Mystery games. We do want to figure out ways to have fun kind of collectively, things that don't necessarily involve whacking, little things over the head. But some of the mystery games and things like Sketchy are really intriguing. How do you kind of inject a sense of fun into what's going on? And then finally, I think that this moment of all moments is a huge, huge opportunity for international entrepreneurs. We're going to see a tremendous number of people really building for their own markets. It could be everything from all of the categories that we talked about. SoloLearn is kind of a great example of a company in Europe that's been doing coding, boot camps and coding camps. We're seeing a lot of those things come up. And so I think that the opportunities for international entrepreneurs are really huge.
So you touched upon this a little bit. So in COVID, one of the very disturbing trends has been a lot of teachers have been compelled to come back into class, and a lot of older teachers have retired as a result of that because they don't feel safe going in to teach. How do you parse this thing? I mean, on the one hand, having younger teachers is going to accelerate the adoption of technology, no question, just because they are digital natives and they're going to be more comfortable in a technology-driven universe. But it is also taking out a wealth of wisdom out of the system. And then also there's like all these people who were nowhere near retirement, ready to retire. What are they going to do with their potentially immense skill in teaching?
Well, we have been concerned about a shortage of teachers for the entire 10 years that I've been intimately involved in the education space. We've been both predicting and incredibly concerned about a huge shortfall of educators. So to some degree, you're correct, but to some degree, this has also been, a perennial issue. I don't know whether it's a positive or a negative. I think that one of the things we've clearly seen is we've seen families of means create small pods and accelerate the quote what had been the homeschooling trend, accelerate that in a really, really interesting way, right? A lot of homeschoolers originally began homeschooling either for religious reasons or out of desperation or because kids had special needs, that sort of thing. They've now been joined by a big community of people who, quite frankly, have the means to hire tutors for small groups. So to some degree, there are going to be opportunities for educators to, quite frankly, be tutors to smaller groups. This is not necessarily a socially equitable or positive trend, so I'm not sort of cheering about it, but I'm saying it's the fact of life. There are going to be opportunities for teachers to teach small groups and small pods, and I think that there will be some segment of the population that figures out that they're going to keep doing that.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea in the sense also that while you say it's not equitable, but at least there's a large population of people who will potentially find employment through those tutoring opportunities. So, and that is important because there's so many segments of people that are, the older nurses are also going through the same experience. The retail workers are going through the same experience. There's a lot of people out there who need to be absorbed somehow into some sort of a work, gainful employment model.
Absolutely.
So, it's not all bad that it's happening. So, what are your thoughts about reskilling the unskilled sector? I think, I think my friend Gus Ty at Trinity Ventures. Well, he's retiring from Trinity. He and I have been talking quite a lot about, what has caused this hyper-polarized country and even the Trump phenomenon and so forth, and this the unskilled population that is really struggling to live with dignity. What are there technology startups or efforts that you see in the EdTech space for reskilling the unskilled sector? Because where we are going, on top of the COVID trend, if you layer on the AI trend, there's massive automation coming down the pipe, which I'm sure you've seen my immense body of writing on this topic. It's been a concern for me for years now. So we're going to, see a 1-2 punch there, and what's going to happen?
Well, as you said, you've written about this pretty extensively, and I don't claim to be an expert. I think that let's take a company like Guild, which is not exactly solving your issue, but is interesting and may offer some directional ideas, right? So what Guild does is it collaborates with employers such as Walmart or McDonald's or, groups that employ large numbers of folks who may or may not have great skills. And it offers those employees an opportunity to improve their skill sets. And sometimes they're improving their skill sets with the goal of getting a better job within their company. But the interesting thing is that Guild has convinced these employers that it's beneficial to offer learning opportunities, even if the result is those people then say, oh, now I can do X and I don't need to work for this company anymore, but I have another opportunity. That's really compelling and I think very powerful. Right now it works because it gets funded by those large companies, the Walmarts and, McDonald's and, other organizations like that. Your question is, okay, well, what about folks who haven't even kind of made it to that sort of level of employer? How do they get those kinds of opportunities? And if I had that answer, I should be, Secretary of Labor, I think. But I think that we've got to continue to search for those opportunities. There is a huge role for government to help subsidize those opportunities for people who are currently underemployed, unemployed, without opportunity. But the critical thing is that it takes real work to design pathways that lead to authentic employment, right? And the challenge is to make sure that we're not just trying to educate people for the sake of feeling good about ourselves or feeling like, oh yeah, you're on a path, but then it becomes a path to nowhere. So there's a huge role for employment organizations, for coaching organizations, for folks who can really help be guides, true Sherpas in helping designate paths. As media, we also kind of, quite frankly, need to write more about the paths and the ways people are succeeding. One of the things that was compelling to me at EdSurge, and I know you do as well, is when you show people here's a path, then they can follow it, right? So at EdSurge, we had lots of people who said, oh, I was a teacher. I didn't know I could start an EdTech company until I read EdSurge and I saw all these people doing it. This is exactly what you do as well. You show people how to be entrepreneurs. Where are the groups that are showing people how they can build careers when they don't have those skill sets?
Yeah.
I don't know, yeah. But I think there's room for that as well.
The role model notion is a very powerful notion, which was at the heart of what I did with 1 million by 1 million.
Exactly.
The concept inside in 1 million by 1 million is the concept of role models. So, Betsy, this is a philosophy question. We were, I may have told you this. I started a literary group with a group of really great people, and some of them you probably know. So we've been doing this since 2016, and we do a project each month, and this is like heavy-duty stuff. We started with Dante's Inferno, and then, Nabokov's Lolita, and this and that, and so one of the projects that we did this year, just recently, is Montaigne's essays. And one of his essays is about education. And on the education of children is the precise name of the essay. And his point is that there is only one thing you actually need to teach children, which is philosophy. And my observation is that that is the one thing that we don't teach children or adults in the world. Nobody teaches philosophy, and as a result, we get these extremely philosophically weak leaders. And I would put Mark Zuckerberg in that category as somebody who's wielding enormous power and has no capacity to think with fundamental philosophical concepts. So, any thoughts on this observation, or are you seeing anything like civic leaders emerging without any training in philosophy or any pedagogy in philosophy is kind of dangerous?
Wow. That's a really interesting question. I can't speak to the training Zuckerberg has or has not had in philosophy or so forth. So I'm going to counter with something slightly different, which I wouldn't do on anybody else's podcast other than yours, which is, with your permission, I would like to read a poem. I've been reading some poetry recently because I think poetry also helps you understand the world when it's very complex. I've got a very short poem. I did not write it, just to be 100% clear. It's written by a poet whose name is Brad Aaron Maudlin. and it's called What You Missed That Day You Were Absent, from the 4th grade. May I read it?
Yes.
Very short.
By all means.
Mrs. Nelson explained how to stand still and listen to the wind, how to find meaning in pumping gas, how peeling potatoes can be a form of prayer. She took questions on how not to feel lost in the dark. After lunch, she distributed worksheets that covered ways to remember your grandfather's voice. Then the class discussed falling asleep without feeling you had forgotten to do something else, something important, and how to believe the house you wake up in is your home. This prompted Mrs. Nelson to draw a chalkboard diagram detailing how to chant the Psalms during cigarette breaks and how not to squirm for sound when your own thoughts are all you hear. Also that you have enough. The English lesson was that I am is a complete sentence. And just before the afternoon bell, she made the math equation look easy, the one that proves that hundreds of questions and feeling cold and all those nights spent looking for whatever it was you lost and one person add up to something.
Beautiful. And it's so much in tune with my philosophy. I know why you read it.
Yes. So the short answer is there are many things we don't learn in school. All of those things in that poem are all the things we wish we learned in the 4th grade, but perhaps many of us take an entire lifetime to learn. We've got a lot to learn about what we're trying to learn and how we're trying to raise children.
Where we are, we live in this excess-ridden world of Silicon Valley where, people think their enormous billions are not enough and they can't find happiness and they have to basically create these orgies in Park City, Utah to feel whole. It's kind of sad that, one of the points that I've made in 1 Million by 1 Million repeatedly and for a long time is excess is not a requirement for success. And if you have mastered that, I think you have mastered life, more or less.
Well, I think that we all have a lot to learn. And I love that poem. I put it in the chat there to share with you. It's part of poetry readings that are a podcast called Poetry Unbound, which I have been enjoying enormously. And I think it's a good reminder that all of the things that we learn are not always the things that we measure, but sometimes the most important ones are, I love this line, how to realize that the home that you wake up in is your home. I think that's really profound.
It is really profound. We go to a lot of hotel kind of houses that are not homes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It was a little bit more philosophical than we normally focus on, and a bit more poetic, I suppose. Anyway, back to more mundane things. If you are doing a startup and if you're looking for methodology guidance, go look at the bootstrapping course on our website. If you just go to sramanamitra.com and it's right at the top there. We've pinned it at the top of the blog. And it's a number of modules. You'll spend an hour going through some of the basics of bootstrapping, and that's helpful. And then you can also, if you're looking for investment, which many of you are, go to the investor introduction tab on the 1mby1m.com website, and we explain the details of how we work with entrepreneurs and how we introduce you to investors. Yes, we will introduce you to investors. In one afternoon, you could get, in half an hour, you could get introduced to 25 investors, but there is preparation involved in getting to that point. So we'll work with you on that preparation. And we do have a terrific network of investors that we work with who always review our deals. All right, so I think that is pretty much all for today. I hope to see some of you at the Free Public Roundtable, which is our working session. If you want feedback from me on your venture, come to one of the roundtables and we'll work on your business. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming today.